Welcome to the Ask the Geographer podcast series, brought to you by the Education Department at the Royal Geographical Society with IBG. I'm Rachel, your host, and in each episode, I'll be joined by geographers from across the globe to delve into current events, publications, and research, all tied to the fascinating world of geography. Today, we're exploring how rivers behave, how humans influence them, and what it takes to manage them sustainably in a changing world. I'm joined by Chrystiann Lavarini, a senior Fluvial geomorphologist at WSP, an environmental and engineering consultancy. Chrystiann's work focuses on how rivers evolve over time, how they interact with the landscape around them, and how we can manage them more sustainably in the face of climate change and land use pressures. Much of his experience involves working on river restoration projects, natural flood management, understanding sediment dynamics, and how human interventions alter river processes. Chrystiann also works closely with ecologists, hydrologists, and engineers, bringing a valuable cross-disciplinary perspective on how river systems function. Chrystiann, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
At A-level, we tend to use the term river regimes. Can you tell us what a regime is?
Absolutely. So a river regime is essentially the pattern of a river flows over the course of a year. So in other words, it's a seasonal rhythm of how much water is in the river. It's a water budget, rising or falling with the seasons. River regimes can vary widely between different rivers due to environment. For example, some rivers have a simple regime. They might have a single peak flow each year, say in spring when snow melts or during rainy season, and a low flow in the dry season. Other rivers have complex regimes with multiple peaks. For instance, a river in equatorial climate might swell twice a year with 2 rainy seasons. So the river regimes come down to a few key factors. One is climate, which is the biggest one. A river in a tropical monsoon region like the Ganges in South Asia will have a huge surge during the monsoon rains and a much lower flow in the dry season, whereas a river fed by mountain snow, like the Rhone in the Alps, peaks in late spring or summer from melting snow. In the UK, many rivers have a winter maximum when rainfall is the highest and plants don't soak up much water, and lower flows in summer. So meanwhile, a desert river might flow only intermittently after rare rains. So each river regime is a unique reflection of climate and geography.
Fantastic. And some of the work you do looks more at river systems. Can you tell us how that differs from regimes, please?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. Their systems are interrelated factors working together in processes, physical processes that interact in the Earth's surface and sometimes even in the other planets as well. So you have the regimes, which are the fluctuations of water, and you have systems which interact between them. So you have one physical regime related to how flows behave, but these flows also interact with the landscape and with the climate, with the topography, with the biology. And these are all the systems, and they combine to create what we know as the landscape. So everything is completed once you look at the entire landscape. And this is one of the things that the geography can bring together, is not looking just a single system, but also how they interrelate to each other.
Fantastic. And thinking more about the regimes, and you mentioned already things like climate, vegetation, topography. What do you feel are the main factors that actually control a river's regime?
Excellent. So climate is probably the most important one. The amount and timing of rainfall or snow directly drive how a river rises and falls. For instance, seasonal monsoons or rainy seasons create a predictable high flood periods, whereas in cold regions, snow melt in spring is critical. Temperature matters because it dictates snow melt and evaporation rates. Another thing is how the geology and soils influence the flow regime as well. So the characteristics of the ground in the river catchment affect how water reaches the river. So for example, if the catchment has a very permeable rock or soils, the rain can infiltrate and be released slowly as groundwater, giving a more steady flow. On the other hand, impermeable or clay soils or steep rock terrains can cause more immediate runoff, and the river spikes quickly after rain then drops, creating a flashy regime. The size and shape of the drainage basin also plays a role. A large basin may have delayed and smoother flow peaks. Water flowing tributaries arrive at different times, whereas a small steep basin can respond to rain almost instantly. Another factor influencing flow regimes is land cover and vegetation. Vegetation is a very powerful tool to modulate a river's flow. So forests and wetlands, for example, they act like sponges. They intercept rain and release it more gradually, reducing flood peaks and sustaining flow in dry periods. If a catchment is deforested or paved over, for example, due to urbanization, more water runs off rapidly into rivers, leading to higher peaks and potentially causing floods. This is a very interesting point because, as my experiences as a geographer in the UK and in Brazil, I could see how vegetation impacts the regime. And one of the works I've done in Brazil was helping restoring a catchment that had been deforested. So we tested multiple land parcel soil units, and we could reduce overland flow with vegetation. And that was a significant reduction in the range of 90% reduction just by having vegetation against bare soil. So it's a really interesting thing. And on the other hand, we had very extreme cases where you have a very urbanized area where basically all the overland flow was not going to groundwater, was going straight to the channel, and we were having massive flashy floods happening. So this is one of the ways the humans' interventions also interact with the regimes of the rivers we live nearby.
Fantastic. And I think that leads us into our next question really, really well. Because our IA-level students often are asked to study a river regime that's been influenced by human activity. And you've already mentioned that most rivers are already affected by human activity. But just for the interest of our audience, is there a particular river that comes to mind where human interference has significantly altered that regime?
Yes, so we have multiple examples, even in the UK as well. We have been altering the landscape of the planet for thousands of years. We have varying levels of intervention. So in the UK, for example, you have more, historically significant impact on the river landscapes. You have been changing patterns of flow for thousands of years, while other more recent colonized areas in tropical areas, for example, they have been experiencing more recently, the last 500 years, let's say, or 100 years in some very recent countries. But one striking example that I could say is the River Nile in Egypt. For millennia, the Nile had a very predictable natural regime. It would rise each year in summer, fed by heavy rains and in the Ethiopian highlands, and flood its valley in Egypt. These annual inundations left behind fertile silt and were the base of the Egyptian agriculture. However, human intervention in the form of large dams completely changed this regime. The construction of the Aswad High Dam, completed in the 1970s, effectively put an end to the Nile's natural flood. And now, instead of a huge annual flood post, the flow of the Nile is controlled by fairly even around the year. So humans have been historically changing how water is released by using weird structures in small scale interventions, but you also have massive dams being built around the world where you literally block and regulate the flow downstream. Another example is the Colorado River in the United States. Historically, the Colorado River regime included the spring snow melt surge, and now it also has large dams that regulate and reduced the flow downstream. So the river's flow downstream is much reduced, with clear cold water coming out of the dams instead of warm silt flood water. And it now barely reaches the sea anymore. And this is one of the main consequences of how rivers can be affected by human intervention. In Scotland, I've worked with people from the University of Glasgow and also other consultants investigating how river impoundment affects sediment transport. So, for example, we have small-scale projects of water abstraction and energy production that are in relatively small scale, but still managed to reduce flow downstream and sometimes block sediment dynamics. So this is something that has been investigated for Scotland, and it has been applied in other countries as well, just making sure not just the water is taken care of, but also how the sediments are distributed downstream.
Brilliant. So there's lots of parts of the river that you have to kind of make sure you're looking after. And you've mentioned already that the work that you do is on river restoration projects. Often this is involving trying to balance environmental recovery with the needs of local communities. Can you share with us an example where this balance has worked particularly well?
Absolutely. One example from my experience is the Whittlebrook Restoration Project in northwest England. This was a project where a small tributary of the River Mersey in Warrington had to be diverted to make a way for new commercial development. And instead of simply digging a straight drainage channel or burying in the brook in a pipe, our team saw this as an opportunity to restore the river to a more natural state while accommodating the development. So the balance here was between the developer's need, which was moving the brook to allow building, but also accommodating environmental enhancement. So we designed a new channel for this Whittlebrook that was about 700 meters long and much more natural in form than the old one. So the original brook had been featured as straight trapezoidal ditch for hundreds of years, maybe even before the 19th century. And the original brook had limited ecological value. And in the new design, we introduced features like meanders and a pool riffle sequence, meaning that the channel alternates between shallow, more energetic riffles to deeper pools, what we call them, where we have slower water flow. We also built in some berms, some shallow ledges along the edges, created point bars, which are small sediment deposits on the insides of the bands, and even a two-stage channel profile to give the brook a modest floodplain within its banks. So all these elements were mimicking how a healthy natural stream in that area would look like. And most importantly, we worked closely with hydrologists and engineers to ensure that the new stream would not increase flood risk downstream, while also making sure we had the feedback from the Environment Agency and having their say on how the river should be in terms of design as well. So the outcome was very positive. And after construction, monitoring has shown that the brook has naturally been adjusting its bank and beds in a way that it mimics the functioning of natural river. So this project at the end delivered something we call biodiverse net gain, which is a new regulation in the UK where you have to bring not just net zero, which it translates into no impact to the biodiversity, but also a positive outcome for biodiversity. And this was created by enhancing the river length that was originally straightened with the new meanders and making sure it's not an ugly, sad, straight ditch anymore. So yeah, this is one of examples of how we can combine meeting engineering objective with also environmentally sustainable enhancement. And yeah, restoration can be integrated into infrastructure project, even when ecology isn't the original priority. And I think regulators are now trying to push for that even more to make sure that this is widespread in the country.
Definitely. By the sounds of it, by working with all these different agencies and stakeholders, it's actually created an area that is far more visually appealing to the people that are actually going to be there using it.
Exactly. So it becomes also to way you improve it because you want to have biodiversity net gain, but it also becomes a place for people to go. And you have many examples in the UK and elsewhere where you have a more beautiful scenario landscape where people can bring their family, bring their dogs, have fun, just have a walk. It becomes a much more appealing place.
Definitely. And then on the flip side, what about cases of restoration that hasn't worked perhaps as well as expected? Could you just tell us what the main challenges or lessons learned from that was?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So one of the things is that not always restoration goes perfectly. And rivers can be unpredictable. So we learn from them and we get insights from how they behave, and we try to avoid mistakes in the future. So one of the things that happens is very common depending on the kind of landscape and the kind of ecology you have, is you should expect ecological responses to vary. So sometimes the biology doesn't respond as quickly as we hope. In one project, not led by me, but in the restoration community, a stream's course was remeandered to improve habitat. Physically, it worked, but the fish population took much longer to populate that area than was originally anticipated. So, despite following textbook recommendations and things on how to do the restoration, nature was taking longer than anticipated. And this brings us to a much broader discussion about not just looking at the form of the river or like how the flow behaves, but also how is the catchment looking like? Which kind of pressures are happening upstream or downstream? Are we having other pressures that can be impacting the recovery of that area? For example, are we having pollution being delivered to the channel? Are we having fertilizers being used in all the sections of the catchment where you're going to be impacting the biological quality elements? Are fish being blocked of migrating upstream due to some weir that exists downstream or any kind of impoundment? So this has to be considered collectively, not just by looking at the river flow or the regime. And another thing is also how humans are going to be working with the restoration. So in some cases, the restoration design might technically work, but fail due to human factors. So for example, I've seen projects where after implementation, local stakeholders weren't on board with how the river changed. For example, letting a river flood onto a floodplain that was historically kept dry. So if those stakeholders then intervene, it can negate the restoration. So this is something we try to balance is making sure we have the community engagement done early on so we can have their opinion. And also, as you said, sometimes you get some benefits that are going to be much broader to the community and people are going to be enjoying a land area where they didn't used to go. So yeah, finding this balance between biological improvement, but also how humans interact with them.
And thinking kind of a little bit more of a wider scale now, access to fresh water is becoming an increasing concern worldwide, especially as our climate is changing. Are there ways rivers can be managed sustainably while still meeting the growing demands for fresh water?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a central challenge for our field, and we approach it with the idea of sustainable water resources management. The key is to balance human needs with the river needs so that taking water doesn't degrade the river in the long term. So one of the approaches is integrated catchment management. Instead of looking at water supply in isolation, we consider the whole river catchment, as I said in the previous answer as well. So this means coordinating how reservoirs, groundwater, and surface waters are used. For example, in wet years, you might store more water in reservoirs, so that in dry years you don't have to drain the river. However, you always ensure the river has an environmental flow, minimum flow that keeps the ecosystem healthy. In practice, environmental regulators, like those enforcing the European Union Water Framework Directive assessment. So this is a very broad term, but it's a kind of regulation that exists in Europe and the UK that needs to ensure that the rivers are not impacted and there's no limitation of improvement as well. So I've been involved in some projects where you have abstract licensing in Ireland, where we conduct a detailed assessment for existing water supply schemes to check that they are sustainable and meaning that they don't push the river below critical flow thresholds that are needed for ecology. So if they do, we have to find solutions which might include altering when or water is taken from the scheme. Water efficiency and demand management is also another way. A sustainable approach isn't just about the river itself, it's about reducing our demand of water. So sometimes managing with the community and the regulators how to wisely and efficiently use the water. Another point is how using technology wisely. In some cases, water storage infrastructure is part of sustainable management, but it should be designed and operated in an eco-friendly way. So, for example, reservoirs can be managed to simulate more natural flow patterns downstream. And some newer dam projects include features like fish passes and sediment bypass systems to reduce ecological disruption. And this is something that I was also involved in this Scottish River investigation with the Glasgow University and some other people. And it was really interesting to see how sediment bypass could mitigate problems of sediment starvation downstream. So you ensure that the fishes have spawning habitats and can take care of the water downstream as well. So basically working with nature than against nature is probably the key here. And also having policy and community involvement, as I said, ensuring that you have the environmental flow rules, which is the flow that is required for biological quality elements to be sustainable downstream, is very important. So working with the community to ensure that the people don't abstract more than they should, and ensuring that we keep the system downstream and upstream healthy as much as we can.
And finally, when we were doing a little bit of background research on you, we found that your career path into fluvial geomorphology was really interesting. For our students who might want to follow a similar path, what advice would you give them?
Great question. I'm going to have to share some advice here. So I followed my passion for rivers through academia and into consulting, and along the way I learned a few things that I could help. First thing, build a strong foundation in the sciences, and school and university focus on subjects like geography, geology, environmental science, or civil engineering, fields that cover earth process and water. I did my bachelor's and master's in geography and then PhD in river processes. You don't have to get a doctorate to work on this field though, but you'll likely need at least a university degree in a relevant field. So what's important in developing is an understanding of how water and earth materials interact. Like courses in hydrology, geomorphology, of course, ecology, and even climate science are helpful. So that's my first tip. The second one would be get hands-on experience and enjoy outdoors. Fluvial geomorphology is very much an observational science, and you learn a huge amount by seeing rivers in the field. And I couldn't stress that more. Going, to the site, just observing the rivers, taking notes, seeing things, going to different landscapes, go and see the world, I would probably say as well to develop your technical analytical skills. Modern environmental work uses a lot of technology. So, for example, being comfortable with geographical information system, GIS, is one thing, because we are always working with spatial data, so you need to be comfortable with that. Nowadays, with programming and artificial intelligence, I would probably say learning about programming is relevant at this stage, and it can be very helpful, especially if you want to be automating things and making sure that you don't spend time doing boring things. And the other one would be to be interdisciplinary and collaborative. One thing I love about geomorphology is that it overlaps with other many sciences. So it's really connected with hydrology, ecology, engineering, geochemistry. So you learn a lot by interacting with other people, and be open-minded to always listen to the other one and have a collaborative point of view, rather than focus just on your discipline. There's another one as well about seeking mentors and professional networks. I strongly recommend engaging with the wider community of geographers and geomorphologists. For example, the Royal Geographical Society is one of them. I find them really interesting. They have lots of interesting connecting people, and it just become a hub for people who want to be knowing about geography and how geographers think and how a geographer can work. And follow your passion. Just do what you think you like doing. The path isn't always straightforward. For example, I moved countries, and it just made things more interesting. And at the end, you just learn from them.
Definitely, that's sage advice. Thank you. Chrystiann, thank you for your time and insights today. It's been fascinating to hear about the opportunities and challenges involved in managing rivers and why sustainable management, but also actually working with multiple stakeholders, is so important. And that's not just for the communities that depend on them, but for maintaining the balance of the natural environment. We really appreciate your time today and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to subscribe to the Ask the Geographer podcast series on soundcloud.com or your preferred streaming platform. Dive deeper into the world of geography and stay informed with our wide range of resources, many of which are available for free. School membership grants access to even more resources, including online lectures and supporting materials for both teachers and learners. Explore our resources and discover our additional offers for education at www.rgs.org/schools.